At Thanksgiving dinner, my daughter-in-law tried to kill me, and I caught her red-handed. The turkey was golden brown, the cranberry sauce gleamed like rubies in crystal bowls, and the dining room smelled of sage and roasted vegetables. Everything looked perfect for our first Thanksgiving without Martha. Everything except the hollow ache in my chest that no amount of family gathering could fill. I stood in the doorway of David's dining room, clutching the bottle of Cabernet that Martha had saved for special occasions. She'd bought it 3 years ago, insisting we'd open it when the time was right. The time never came before the cancer took her. Now, staring at my son's perfectly set table, I wondered if this qualified as right, or if I was just desperate to feel connected to something that felt like home. "Dad, you made it." David appeared at my elbow, his smile warm but strained around the edges. At 38, he carried himself with the careful posture of a man trying to hold too many pieces together. "You didn't have to bring anything. Sarah's got everything covered." Sarah. My daughter-in-law of 6 years emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. At 34, she moved through her house like a choreographed dancer, every gesture calculated for maximum effect. Her blonde hair was swept into the kind of effortless updo that took an hour to perfect, and her smile was bright enough to power the chandelier overhead. "Bob, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with honey that somehow tasted bitter. "You look tired. Are you getting enough rest?" The question hit like a gentle slap. I'd heard variations of it from her for months now, always delivered with that same concerned tilt of her head, always in front of witnesses. "I'm managing fine, Sarah. Brought Martha's favorite wine. Thought we could share it today." Her eyes flickered to the bottle, then back to my face. "Oh, how thoughtful. Though I'm not sure wine is the best idea for you right now. You know how it can make you foggy." Foggy. Another one of her favorite words. She'd been sprinkling them into conversations like salt on a wound. Confused, forgetful, declining. Each word carefully chosen, carefully placed, building a narrative I hadn't authorized. "The wine is fine, Sarah," David interjected, taking the bottle from my hands. "Dad knows his limits." "Of course he does," Sarah agreed, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I just worry, after what happened last month at the grocery store." Last month. The incident where I'd supposedly wandered off and forgotten where I'd parked. Except I remembered it differently. I remembered Sarah calling me, insisting I meet her there, then disappearing for 40 minutes while I waited in the pharmacy section. When David found me, she'd painted it as another episode of my increasing confusion. The other guests were arriving now. David's co-workers, Sarah's sister Jennifer with her husband Mark, and the Hendersons from next door. Mrs. Henderson caught my eye and nodded, her weathered face kind. She'd been our neighbor for 15 years, had brought casseroles after Martha's funeral, and never once suggested I was losing my grip on reality. "Everyone, dinner's ready," Sarah announced, clapping her hands together like a kindergarten teacher. "Bob, I've put you right here." She guided me to a chair at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation, but perfectly positioned for observation. The meal began with the usual pleasantries. David carved the turkey with the precision of a surgeon, while Sarah played the perfect hostess, refilling glasses and ensuring everyone's needs were met. She was good at this performance, I had to admit. The concerned daughter-in-law, the devoted wife, the woman who'd taken on the burden of caring for her husband's aging father. "Bob, you're not eating much," she observed, loud enough for the table to hear. "Are you feeling all right?" I looked down at my plate. The food was excellent, but my appetite had disappeared somewhere between the front door and my assigned seat. Just taking my time. Of course. Sometimes it takes longer to process things as we get older. She turned to the table with a conspiratorial smile. "I've been researching some wonderful assisted living facilities. The one in Millbrook has a fantastic dining program. No cooking required." The conversation around the table shifted, becoming more cautious. I felt the weight of their glances, the careful way they measured their words. This was how it happened, I realized. Not with dramatic confrontations or obvious cruelty, but with gentle suggestions and public concerns that slowly eroded your standing until everyone agreed you needed help you'd never asked for. "Speaking of beverages," Sarah said, rising from her chair, "I made something special for dessert. A signature cocktail I've been perfecting. Bob, you'll love this one. It's very smooth, very relaxing. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a tray of glasses, filled with an amber liquid that caught the dining room light. The drinks looked elegant, garnished with orange peel and what appeared to be cinnamon sticks. She set one in front of each guest, saving mine for last. "This is my grandmother's recipe," she explained, her hand briefly touching my shoulder. "Bourbon, honey, and a few secret ingredients. It's supposed to help with digestion and, well, it's very calming. Perfect for settling in after a big meal." She handed me the glass with both hands, her fingers brushing mine. The liquid had a different consistency than the others, slightly thicker, and when I raised it toward my lips, the smell was off. Bourbon and honey, yes, but something else underneath. Something medicinal. "Cheers to family," Sarah said, raising her glass. Everyone followed suit, but I hesitated. "Go ahead, Bob," she encouraged, her voice soft but insistent. "This will help you relax. You've seemed so tense lately." I brought the glass to my lips and pretended to take a sip. The liquid barely touched my tongue, but I could taste the bitter undertone that had nothing to do with whiskey. My stomach turned, not from the drink, but from the realization of what was happening. I said, setting the glass down. "That's quite something." "Isn't it? Drink up. There's plenty more where that came from." Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on my glass, watching for signs that her cocktail was taking effect. Around the table, the conversation had moved on to holiday plans and work stories, but I could feel Sarah's attention like a weight on my shoulders. She was waiting for something, waiting for me to become the confused, tired old man she'd been describing to everyone for months. The room began to feel warmer. My eyelids grew heavy, though I'd barely touched the drink. Whatever she'd put in there was powerful enough that even the small amount on my tongue was having an effect. I blinked slowly, letting my shoulders sag slightly, giving her what she expected to see. "Oh, Bob," she said, her voice filled with false sympathy. "You look exhausted. Maybe you should lie down in the guest room for a bit." "I'm fine," I mumbled, though the words came out slightly slurred. Not from the drug, but from the performance I was now conscious of giving. "No, you're not fine. Look at you." She turned to David. "Honey, I think your dad needs to rest." This is exactly what I was worried about. David frowned, studying my face. "Dad, are you okay? You do look a little off." I let my eyes close for a moment longer than necessary. "Just tired, son. Long day." "Of course you're tired," Sarah said, standing up and moving behind my chair. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. Here, finish your drink, it'll help you sleep." She leaned down, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered so quietly that only I could hear. "Drink up, Bob. You need your rest." The malice in her voice was unmistakable now, stripped of all pretense. This wasn't concern. This was something far more deliberate and dangerous. I picked up the glass again, brought it to my lips, and this time made sure she saw me take what appeared to be a long swallow. In reality, I barely let the liquid touch my mouth before setting the glass down with a satisfied sigh. "Better?" she asked, her smile returning to full brightness. "Much," I said, letting my voice carry the weight of manufactured drowsiness. "Thank you, Sarah. You always know just what I need." Her smile widened, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it looked genuine. The smile of someone who believed they'd won. The drive home that night felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the dark leather. The taste of Sarah's cocktail lingered faintly on my tongue, a bitter reminder of how close I'd come to drinking whatever she'd mixed into that amber liquid. The fog that had settled over my thoughts during dinner was lifting now, replaced by something sharper and more unsettling. Back in my kitchen, I made coffee strong enough to strip paint and sat at the table where Martha and I had shared thousands of meals. The silence felt different tonight, not peaceful but charged with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I pulled out a notepad and started writing, the way Martha had taught me to work through problems, one fact at a time, building a foundation before reaching for conclusions. Fact 1. Sarah had deliberately drugged my drink. The bitter taste, her insistence that I finish it, the way she'd watched me like a scientist monitoring an experiment. There was no innocent explanation for what had happened tonight. Fact 2. This wasn't the first time I'd felt strange after visiting their house. The memory surfaced slowly, like something emerging from deep water. 3 weeks ago, after Sunday dinner, I'd driven home feeling dizzy and disoriented. I'd chalked it up to fatigue, maybe too much wine with the roast. But now, replaying the evening, I remembered Sarah's particular attention to my glass, her insistence on refilling it personally. The coffee grew cold as more pieces clicked into place. The incident at the grocery store last month, when I'd supposedly wandered off confused. I'd been waiting for Sarah in the pharmacy section, just as we'd arranged on the phone. But when David found me, she'd painted a completely different picture. A worried daughter-in-law searching for her confused father-in-law who couldn't remember where he'd parked. I walked to Martha's desk in the corner of the living room, where she'd kept our important papers organized in her methodical way. Her handwriting was still visible on the file labels: insurance, medical records, finances. I pulled out the medical folder and flipped through the contents. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something that made my stomach clench. At the bottom of the stack were appointment confirmation letters for doctors I'd never heard of. Dr. Martinez, neurologist; Dr. Patterson, geriatric psychiatrist; Dr. Kim, internal medicine specialist focusing on age-related cognitive decline. The appointments were all scheduled for next month, all made in my name, all marked as referrals from Dr. Williams, my longtime family physician. Except I'd never asked Dr. Williams for referrals. I'd never mentioned memory problems or confusion because I wasn't experiencing any. Someone else had made these appointments, someone who had access to my insurance information and enough medical knowledge to sound convincing on the phone. I called Dr. Williams's emergency line, knowing he'd be annoyed to hear from me on Thanksgiving night, but needing answers more than sleep. He picked up on the third ring, his voice warm despite the late hour. "Bob, everything all right? You sound upset." "Jim, did you refer me to any specialists recently? Neurologists or psychiatrists?" There was a pause. "No, Bob. Why would I? You're sharp as a tack. Physically, you're in better shape than men half your age. Someone made appointments with 3 different doctors, all supposedly based on your referrals, all dealing with cognitive issues." Another pause, longer this time. "Bob, that's medical fraud. Someone's building a paper trail, making it look like you're experiencing mental decline. Do you have any idea who might?" "I have suspicions." I told him about the dinner, about Sarah's cocktail and her pattern of concerned comments. Dr. Williams listened without interrupting, his breathing steady on the other end of the line. "Bob, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. We're going to run some blood work, check for any substances that shouldn't be there. And I want you to bring those appointment letters. If someone's trying to establish a medical record of incompetency, we need to document what's really happening." After hanging up, I walked through my house with new eyes. In the medicine cabinet, I found 3 prescription bottles I didn't recognize. Lorazepam, prescribed to Sarah Mitchell for anxiety; Zolpidem, a sleep aid, also in her name; and something called risperidone, an antipsychotic that, according to the label, could cause drowsiness and confusion in elderly patients. The bottles were nearly empty, which meant the contents had gone somewhere. I thought about all the times Sarah had offered to make me tea when I visited, how she'd insisted on preparing my plate at family dinners, the way she'd hover near my glass during social gatherings. I'd attributed it to daughterly concern. Now it looked like something much more calculating. I found my old lockbox in the bedroom closet and gathered all the evidence: the appointment letters, the prescription bottles, the notepad where I'd written down tonight's events. Martha had always said that documentation was everything, that problems couldn't hide from good record keeping. She'd been talking about household finances at the time, but the principle held true for whatever game Sarah was playing. The house phone rang at 11:30, making me jump. David's number on the caller ID. "Dad, Sarah's worried about you. She said you seemed really out of it during dinner more than usual. Maybe we should talk about getting you some help." More than usual. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. How many conversations had they had about my supposed decline? How many times had Sarah reported incidents that never happened, or twisted normal moments into evidence of incompetency? "I'm fine, son. Just tired." That's what you always say. But Sarah thinks. We both think maybe it's time to consider some options. Adult daycare maybe, or someone to check on you during the week. Just until you're feeling more like yourself. Until I'm feeling more like myself. The person they decided I was becoming. Confused, dependent, a burden that needed managing. I thought about the psychiatric appointments Sarah had scheduled. The specialists who would undoubtedly recommend exactly the kind of supervision David was suggesting. David? Has Sarah ever mentioned finding medication bottles around your house? Bottles that don't belong to her? What? No, why would... Dad, are you mixing up your medications? That's exactly the kind of thing we're worried about. Every question I asked became evidence of the very confusion they claimed to be addressing. It was a perfect circle. If I acted concerned about being drugged, I sounded paranoid. If I seemed fine, they could point to moments like tonight's dinner as proof that I was hiding my symptoms. Sarah had constructed a trap with no visible exit. Never mind, son. We'll talk later. Dad, wait. Sarah wanted me to ask, have you given any thought to updating your will recently? She mentioned that a lot of elderly people find peace of mind in getting their affairs in order. Just in case. Just in case. The words echoed in my head long after David hung up. Just in case of what? Just in case the psychiatric evaluations went according to plan? Just in case I became too confused to make my own decisions? Just in case I had an accident after drinking one of Sarah's special cocktails? I sat in Martha's chair, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy I was only beginning to understand. Sarah wasn't just trying to make me look incompetent. She was building toward something bigger. The medical appointments, the prescriptions, the concerned family meetings about my declining condition. It was all leading somewhere specific, somewhere that ended with me having no say in my own life. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of Thanksgiving and the beginning of whatever came next. I thought about Martha's voice, calm and steady during the worst moments of her illness. Problems don't solve themselves, Bob. But they do get smaller when you look at them straight on. I was looking now, and what I saw was a war that had started without my knowledge. Sarah had been playing a long game, moving pieces into position while I grieved my wife and tried to figure out how to live alone. But she'd made one critical mistake tonight. She'd shown her hand too clearly. The bitter taste of her cocktail was still on my tongue, proof that this wasn't just paranoia or grief making me suspicious. Tomorrow I would start gathering evidence. Tonight, I would plan. Friday morning brought the kind of cold November rain that makes everything look gray and uncertain. I was at Dr. Williams's office by 8:30, the earliest appointment he could arrange. The blood draw took less than 5 minutes, but sending the samples to a lab that could test for the specific compounds I suspected would take 3 days. 3 days of acting normal while carrying the knowledge that someone was systematically poisoning me. Bob, I've been your doctor for 22 years, Jim said, settling back in his chair after reviewing the forged appointment letters. These referrals are sophisticated forgeries. Whoever did this knows medical terminology and understands how the system works. This isn't random. I thought about Sarah's educational background, something I'd never paid much attention to before. She'd worked in medical administration before marrying David, handling insurance claims and patient records for a cardiology practice. She would know exactly which doctors to contact, which symptoms to report, how to make the referrals look legitimate. Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have I shown any signs of cognitive decline? Any reason for concern? He leaned forward, studying my face with the intensity he'd once used to diagnose Martha's cancer. Bob, your mind is as sharp as it was the day we met. You remember details from conversations we had months ago. You manage your finances, maintain your property, drive safely. If anything, you're handling grief better than most people handle a bad cold. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much doubt Sarah's campaign had planted in my own mind until Jim's words washed it away. I wasn't losing my grip on reality. Someone was trying very hard to make it look like I was. After leaving the doctor's office, I drove to Electronics Plus, a store I'd avoided since Martha died because the young employees made me feel ancient. Today, that anonymity was exactly what I needed. I purchased a small digital recorder, 2 wireless security cameras, and a basic monitoring system that could send alerts to my phone. The salesperson, a kid named Marcus with purple hair and infinite patience, helped me understand the basics without making me feel stupid. The cameras are motion activated, he explained, demonstrating with a device no bigger than a smoke detector. They'll start recording automatically when someone enters the room, and you can watch everything remotely on your phone. The audio quality is excellent, clear enough to pick up whispered conversations. Back home, I installed one camera in the kitchen, positioned to capture the area around the counter where drinks were prepared. The second went in the living room, aimed at the seating area where most conversations took place. Both were small enough to blend into the decor, hidden among Martha's collection of small decorative items that I'd never had the heart to pack away. The digital recorder was even simpler. I tested it by recording myself reading from the newspaper, then playing it back. The clarity was remarkable. Every word came through perfectly, even when I spoke barely above a whisper. I slipped it into my shirt pocket where it was completely invisible but could capture conversations within a 10-foot radius. That afternoon, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, and asked if she could spare a few minutes for coffee. Eleanor Henderson was 73, sharp as a razor, and had been watching the neighborhood dynamics with the keen eye of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried 1 husband. If anyone had noticed unusual patterns in my behavior, it would be her. She arrived with homemade banana bread and a thermos of coffee that smelled like heaven. We sat in my kitchen, the same spot where Martha and I had entertained friends for 37 years, and I told her everything. The forged medical appointments, the prescription bottles, Sarah's increasingly pointed comments about my mental state. "Bob," she said when I finished, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." The words hit me like cold water. "You knew?" I suspected. Sarah's been asking me questions for months. Casual things, she claimed, but always about your behavior. Had I noticed you seeming confused? Did you ever forget to bring in your mail or leave your car running? She was fishing for stories, looking for ammunition. Eleanor pulled a small notebook from her purse, the kind she used for grocery lists and garden planning. I started writing down her visits after the 3rd one. She came by 6 times in the last 2 months, always when David wasn't with her, always asking about your mental state. The last time she suggested that I should call David if I ever saw you acting strangely. The systematic nature of Sarah's campaign was becoming clearer. She wasn't just drugging me. She was building a network of witnesses who would testify to my declining condition when the time came. Neighbors, family friends, medical professionals, all carefully cultivated to support her narrative. "Eleanor, when she asked these questions, what did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're grieving but competent. That you take better care of your property than homeowners half your age. That you're lonely, but not confused." She paused, studying my face. "Bob." I think she was disappointed by my answers. We spent the next hour reviewing Eleanor's notes, creating a timeline of Sarah's visits and the questions she'd asked. Each conversation had been slightly different, but the underlying theme remained constant, gathering evidence of my incompetency. When Eleanor left, she promised to keep documenting any future approaches from Sarah or David. That evening, I called the law office of Harrison and Associates, a firm that specialized in elder law and had handled Martha's estate planning. Margaret Harrison herself took my call, her voice professional but warm. "Mr. Mitchell, I remember you well. How can I help?" I explained the situation as calmly as possible, focusing on facts rather than suspicions. The forged medical referrals, the prescription medications in Sarah's name, the pattern of concerned observations about my mental state. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or details. "Bob, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of financial elder abuse with a sophisticated psychological component. The perpetrator is building a case for incompetency, probably as a precursor to seeking guardianship or conservatorship." The word guardianship made my stomach turn. I'd seen it happen to other elderly people in the neighborhood, well-meaning family members who gradually took control of finances, property, and personal decisions. Once the legal machinery was in motion, it was almost impossible to reverse. "Margaret, what can I do to protect myself?" "Document everything. Keep detailed records of every interaction, every concerning comment, every attempt to medicate you without your consent. We'll need to establish a clear pattern of manipulation before we can take legal action." She scheduled an appointment for the following week and recommended that I undergo a complete cognitive evaluation by an independent psychiatrist, someone who had no connection to Sarah's forged referrals. We need medical testimony that you're competent to make your own decisions. It'll be crucial if this goes to court. After hanging up, I sat in Martha's chair and thought about the scope of what I was facing. Sarah had been planning this for months, possibly since Martha's death. Every family dinner, every concerned comment, every offer to help with my medications or finances had been part of a larger strategy. She was patient, methodical, and clever enough to make her abuse look like care. But she'd made mistakes too. The forged referrals were too sophisticated, revealing knowledge she shouldn't have had. The prescription bottles in her name were direct evidence of the source of the drugs. Most importantly, she'd underestimated my ability to recognize what was happening and fight back. I pulled out my phone and activated the camera monitoring app Marcus had installed. 2 green lights indicated both cameras were online and recording. The digital recorder in my shirt pocket was voice-activated, ready to capture any conversation that might reveal Sarah's true intentions. The evidence gathering had begun in earnest. Sarah thought she was playing chess against a confused old man who couldn't see more than one move ahead. She was about to discover that losing Martha had made me grief-stricken, not stupid, and that 37 years of marriage to a woman who never backed down from a fight had taught me more about strategic patience than she could imagine. Tomorrow, David would probably call to check on me, prompted by Sarah's report of my concerning behavior at Thanksgiving dinner. I would be ready for that conversation, recorder running, questions prepared. Sarah wanted to paint me as incompetent? I would let her try while documenting every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to rewrite the truth. The rain continued to fall against the kitchen window, but inside, I felt warmer than I had since Martha died. For the first time in months, I had a purpose beyond grief, a problem that required the kind of methodical thinking that had made me successful in business. Sarah had started this game, but she was about to learn that some opponents don't give up as easily as she'd hoped. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp December wind that cuts through wool coats and reminds you that winter means business. I was dressed and ready by 7, having spent most of the night reviewing the notes I'd accumulated over the weekend. The blood test results wouldn't be available until Wednesday, but I couldn't wait for confirmation of what I already knew. Sarah's campaign was accelerating, and I needed to be 3 steps ahead of whatever she planned next. My first stop was First National Bank, where I'd maintained accounts for over 20 years. Patricia Chen, the branch manager, greeted me with the warm smile reserved for customers whose mortgages had been paid on time for decades. Her expression shifted to concern when I explained why I was there. "Mr. Mitchell, you want to establish a new account that's completely separate from your existing ones?" "That's right. I need financial protection from someone who might try to gain access to my primary accounts." I kept my voice level, factual. "I'd also like to review the activity on my current accounts for the past 6 months, looking for any unauthorized access attempts or unusual inquiries." Patricia's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. After several minutes, she looked up with a frown. "Bob, there have been 3 attempts to access your account information online using incorrect login credentials, all in the past month, all originating from the same IP address." The news didn't surprise me, but having documentation made it real in a way that suspicion couldn't match. "Can you trace that IP address?" "Not specifically, but I can tell you it's local. Someone in this area has been trying to get into your accounts." Patricia printed out the activity report and highlighted the relevant entries. "Bob, I'm going to flag your accounts for additional security. Any future access attempts will require in-person verification with photo identification." The new account was established under the name Robert E. Mitchell Trust, a legal entity that Margaret Harrison had recommended during our phone conversation. I transferred $40,000 from my savings, enough to cover legal fees and living expenses for several months if Sarah's plan succeeded in freezing my other assets. The trust documentation would be filed by the end of the week, creating a financial firewall that would be extremely difficult for anyone else to penetrate. From the bank, I drove to Harrison and Associates for my appointment with Margaret. Her office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that whispered competence and discretion. Margaret herself was in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. "Bob, I've reviewed the materials you provided over the phone. What we're looking at is a sophisticated campaign of financial and psychological elder abuse. The forged medical referrals alone constitute multiple felonies. She spread the evidence across her conference table. The prescription bottles in Sarah's name, the fake appointment letters, Eleanor Henderson's notes documenting Sarah's inquiries about my mental state. Each piece by itself might seem insignificant, but together they painted a clear picture of systematic manipulation. The pattern is textbook, Margaret continued. Isolate the victim by questioning their competency in public settings. Create a medical paper trail suggesting cognitive decline. Gain access to financial accounts and important documents. Finally, petition for guardianship or conservatorship based on the fabricated evidence. How long does that process usually take? If someone has done their homework properly, they can move very quickly once they decide to file. We're probably looking at weeks, not months, before Sarah makes her move. Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began writing. We need to get ahead of this. I'm recommending a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by Dr. Sarah Brennan, an independent neuropsychologist who specializes in competency assessments. We'll also need a complete physical exam documenting your current health status. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would be undergoing the same type of evaluations Sarah had tried to arrange, but on my terms with doctors I could trust. Margaret also recommended updating my power of attorney documents to explicitly exclude Sarah from any decision-making authority and creating an advance directive that would prevent involuntary commitment to any care facility. There's one more thing, Bob. I want you to consider hiring a private investigator, someone who can document Sarah's activities, track her communications, maybe dig into her background. If she's done this before, there might be a pattern we can establish. The suggestion made sense, though it felt like another step into a world I'd never imagined entering. Margaret provided the name of an investigator she'd worked with before, Frank Rodriguez, a former police detective who specialized in family financial crimes. I called his office before leaving the law firm and scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. Frank's office was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, deliberately unremarkable and easily overlooked. Frank himself was about my age, stocky and graying, with the kind of steady manner that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't easily impressed. Bob, Margaret filled me in on the basics. Your daughter-in-law is building a case for your incompetency while simultaneously trying to drug you. That's bold, even by the standards of family financial abuse. We spent 2 hours going through every detail I could remember. Sarah's questions about my finances, her offers to help with medications, the incident at the grocery store, her pattern of public comments about my mental state. Frank took notes in a neat shorthand, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or witnesses. Here's what we're going to do, Frank said when I finished. First, I'm going to run a complete background check on Sarah. Employment history, previous marriages, financial records, criminal history if any. People who do this kind of thing rarely start with their first victim. He pulled out a contract and explained the terms. His daily rate was higher than I'd expected, but Margaret had warned me that protecting myself would be expensive. Second, I'm going to install some additional surveillance equipment at your house. More sophisticated than what you bought at Electronics Plus, harder to detect if Sarah becomes suspicious. The idea of my home becoming a surveillance center was unsettling, but Frank's reasoning was sound. We need to document her behavior when she thinks no one is watching. The cameras you installed are good, but we need audio that will hold up in court and visual coverage of all the areas where she might try to plant evidence or steal documents. Frank also recommended that I start varying my routines to make it harder for Sarah to predict my movements. If she's planning something that requires you to be in a specific place at a specific time, we want to disrupt that timeline, shop for groceries on different days, visit different restaurants, take routes she wouldn't expect. By the time I left Frank's office, I had a comprehensive security plan and a team of professionals working to protect my interests. The cost was substantial, but Margaret had made it clear that losing control of my finances and freedom would cost far more than any legal or investigative fees. That evening, David called just as I was finishing dinner. The timing felt deliberate, catching me when I might be tired or less alert. I activated the digital recorder before answering, a habit that was becoming automatic. Dad, Sarah mentioned that you seemed really confused on Thanksgiving. She's worried that you might be having more serious problems than we realized. The conversation followed a predictable pattern. David expressing concern, Sarah's observations presented as medical evidence, gentle suggestions that I might need more supervision or assistance. I responded carefully, acknowledging his concerns without admitting to any confusion or memory problems. David, has Sarah mentioned finding any prescription bottles around your house that don't belong to her? What kind of question is that? Dad, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're asking random questions that don't make sense. Every inquiry I made about Sarah's behavior was being reframed as evidence of my own confusion. It was masterfully done, creating a logical trap where any attempt to defend myself looked like further proof of the very problems they claimed to be addressing. Son, I think I should probably have a complete medical evaluation just to establish a baseline. Would that ease your concerns? The suggestion seemed to surprise him. Well, yes, that would be great. Sarah actually found some doctors who specialize in age-related issues. I could give you their numbers. I've already scheduled appointments with doctors that Margaret Harrison recommended. Independent evaluations, no referrals from anyone in the family. There was a pause on David's end of the line. Dad, why are you involving lawyers? That seems like an overreaction. Because someone has been making medical appointments in my name without my knowledge, and I want to make sure my interests are protected. Another pause. Longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice had cooled noticeably. Dad, if you're going to make this adversarial, we might need to consider other options. Other options. The phrase hung in the air after he ended the call. I sat in my kitchen listening to the recording of our conversation and realized that the war Sarah had started was about to move into its next phase. My decision to hire lawyers and investigators had been interpreted as confirmation that I was becoming paranoid and difficult to manage. Tomorrow, Frank would begin his background investigation of Sarah. Dr. Brennan would conduct her competency evaluation on Thursday. The blood test results would confirm what I already knew about the drugs in my system. All the pieces were moving into place, but Sarah was moving too, and I could feel the acceleration of whatever she had planned. I thought about Martha, about the quiet strength she'd shown during her final months when the cancer tried to take not just her life, but her dignity. She'd fought every step of the way, documenting her wishes, making sure her voice would be heard even when she could no longer speak. I was fighting a different kind of cancer now, one that attacked families instead of bodies, but the principle was the same. Document everything, trust the right people, and never let anyone else write the story of your life. The blood test results arrived on Wednesday morning via secure email from Dr. Williams's office. I printed the report twice, once for my files and once for Margaret Harrison, then sat at my kitchen table studying the clinical language that confirmed what I already knew. Lorazepam, zolpidem, and traces of risperidone. All three medications found in Sarah's prescription bottles, now documented in my bloodstream at levels consistent with deliberate dosing over several weeks. My phone rang before I could finish reading the full report. Dr. Williams, his voice tight with controlled anger. Bob, I've seen a lot of things in 30 years of practice, but this level of systematic poisoning is beyond anything I've encountered. The concentrations suggest someone has been drugging you regularly for at least a month, possibly longer. The medical terminology felt surreal when applied to my own life. Jim, what kind of effects would these drugs have at these levels? Confusion, drowsiness, memory problems, difficulty with coordination and decision-making. Basically, they would create every symptom someone would expect to see in early-stage dementia or severe depression. His voice carried the weight of professional outrage. Bob, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't accidental or amateur. I thanked Jim and immediately called Margaret Harrison to schedule an emergency meeting. The blood test results changed everything, transforming suspicions into criminal evidence. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in her office while she reviewed the lab report with the focused intensity of a prosecutor building a case. Bob, this is attempted poisoning with intent to incapacitate. It's a felony in this state, possibly multiple felonies depending on how long it's been going on. Margaret made notes on her legal pad with quick, precise strokes. We need to move faster than I originally planned. Sarah may be preparing to file for emergency guardianship based on your supposed mental decline. The emergency meeting was interrupted by a call from Frank Rodriguez. His background investigation of Sarah had uncovered information that made my situation even more dangerous than we'd realized. Bob, Your daughter-in-law has done this before. Married name Sarah Chen. Divorced after 3 years when her first husband's family discovered she'd been systematically draining his disabled father's accounts while claiming to care for him. No charges were filed because the family wanted to avoid publicity, but the pattern is identical. Frank's voice carried the grim satisfaction of a detective who'd found the missing piece of a puzzle. She worked in medical administration for 4 different practices over the past 10 years, and each job ended when medications went missing or patient records were altered. She knows the system inside and out. Margaret and I exchanged glances across her conference table. Sarah wasn't just an opportunistic daughter-in-law. She was a professional predator who'd targeted vulnerable elderly people before. The systematic nature of her campaign against me suddenly made perfect sense. Frank, what happened to the first husband's father, ended up in a care facility after being declared incompetent. Died 6 months later from what the death certificate called complications from dementia, but the family always suspected he'd been drugged into that condition. They just couldn't prove it. The room fell silent except for the scratch of Margaret's pen against paper. I thought about Martha's final months, how she'd fought to maintain her dignity and independence even as the cancer tried to take both. The idea that Sarah might be planning a similar fate for me but through legal manipulation rather than disease made my hands shake with suppressed rage. Margaret, what's our next step? We file for a restraining order immediately and we notify the police about the poisoning. The blood test results give us probable cause for criminal charges. She reached for her phone. I'm also going to request an emergency hearing to establish your competency before Sarah can file anything claiming the opposite. The next few hours passed in a blur of legal paperwork and phone calls. Frank installed additional surveillance equipment in my house, including cameras so small they could be hidden inside picture frames, and a recording system that would capture conversations in every room. Margaret prepared an emergency petition for protective orders while I signed documents that would freeze my assets if anyone tried to access them, without proper legal authority. By Thursday evening, David called with the news I'd been expecting. His voice carried a mixture of frustration and what sounded like genuine concern, though I could no longer be certain which emotions were real and which were Sarah's coaching. Dad, we need to talk. Sarah thinks you're becoming paranoid. All this business with lawyers and investigators, it's not normal behavior. I activated the digital recorder, a motion that had become as automatic as checking my watch. David, what would you consider normal behavior when someone discovers they've been systematically poisoned? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When David spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming more formal and distant. Dad, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're making accusations that don't make sense. Sarah has been nothing but helpful and caring since Mom died. Son, I have blood test results showing 3 different prescription medications in my system. Medications that I never took, all prescribed to your wife. Dad, you're clearly confused about your medications. Sarah mentioned that she found pills scattered around your house when she was cleaning. You probably took them by accident and forgot. The conversation was following Sarah's script so perfectly that I wondered if she was coaching David in real time. Every piece of evidence I presented was being reframed as proof of the very confusion they claimed to be treating. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Someone has been drugging me for weeks, possibly months. The same person has been making fake medical appointments in my name and trying to access my bank accounts online. I have documentation of all of this. Dad, please listen to yourself. You sound paranoid. You're talking about conspiracies and plots that don't exist. David's voice took on the patient tone people use when talking to children or confused elderly relatives. Sarah and I have been discussing this, and we think you need professional help. Not just medical attention, but maybe a supervised environment where you can get the care you need. There it was. The conversation I'd been dreading since Thanksgiving night. David wasn't just concerned about my mental state. He was building toward institutionalization. Sarah's plan was accelerating, probably because she'd realized that I was fighting back and gathering evidence. What kind of supervised environment are you talking about, son? There's a facility called Meadowbrook that specializes in memory care. Sarah toured it last week and they have an opening. It's not permanent, just until we can get your medications sorted out and make sure you're stable. Sarah had toured a memory care facility. The words hit me like physical blows. While I'd been gathering evidence of her crimes, she'd been shopping for a place to warehouse me. The efficiency of it was breathtaking and terrifying. David, I'm not going to any facility. I'm mentally competent, physically healthy, and living independently. If you try to force this, I'll fight it in court. Dad, that attitude is exactly why we're concerned. You're being defensive and combative about getting help you clearly need. David's voice was rising now, frustration bleeding through the careful patience. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect you from yourself. Protect me from myself. The phrase that every controlling person uses when they want to justify taking away someone's freedom. I'd heard it from adult children talking about their parents, from husbands discussing their wives, from anyone who'd decided that love meant making decisions for other people. David, before you make any irreversible decisions, I want you to consider something. What if you're wrong? What if the person you're trusting to guide these decisions isn't who you think she is? Dad, Sarah has been nothing but patient and caring. She's the one who noticed your problems before anyone else did. She's been documenting incidents, trying to help us understand what's happening to you. Documenting incidents, creating evidence, building a case. Sarah's methodology was becoming clearer with every conversation. She wasn't just drugging me. She was creating a comprehensive record that would support her narrative in any legal proceeding. Son, I'm going to ask you one more time. Has Sarah ever shown you prescription bottles with medications that don't belong to her? Dad, you're fixated on this medication thing. It's not healthy. Sarah thinks you might be developing obsessive thoughts, which can be a sign of advancing dementia. Every question I asked was being pathologized, turned into evidence of the very condition they claimed to be treating. It was a perfect psychological trap. The more I fought back, the more defensive and paranoid I appeared to become. After David hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to the recording of our conversation. Sarah's voice wasn't on the tape, but her influence was clear in every exchange. David was no longer speaking as my son. He was reciting lines from a script she'd written. I called Margaret Harrison's emergency number and played the recording over the phone. Her response was immediate and decisive. Bob, we're filing for emergency protective orders tomorrow morning. This conversation makes it clear that they're planning involuntary commitment proceedings. We need to get ahead of this before they can file anything claiming you're an immediate danger to yourself. That night, I lay awake in the house where Martha and I had raised our son, thinking about how completely Sarah had corrupted that relationship. David genuinely believed he was protecting me, which made him more dangerous than if he'd been acting out of malice. Sarah had weaponized his love, turned his concern into a tool for my destruction. The cameras Frank had installed captured everything now. Sarah's next move would be documented, recorded, preserved for whatever legal battle was coming. I thought about the first husband's father, the man who died in a facility after being declared incompetent. Sarah's previous victim, whose family had chosen silence over justice. I would not be choosing silence. Friday morning brought an urgency I hadn't felt since Martha's diagnosis. Margaret had scheduled an emergency competency hearing for 10 o'clock, but Sarah was moving faster than we'd anticipated. At 7:30, 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway. David's SUV, a white sedan I didn't recognize, and a van marked Meadowbrook Care Services. I watched through the kitchen window as Sarah emerged from the sedan with 2 people in medical scrubs, while David climbed out of his vehicle carrying a folder thick with papers. The van disgorged 2 orderlies who looked like they'd been hired more for muscle than medical expertise. The invasion force had arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank Rodriguez. Police en route, recording everything, stay calm. The doorbell rang with the kind of insistent urgency that suggested they weren't planning to wait for a polite response. I activated the digital recorder in my shirt pocket and opened the door to find Sarah flanked by a woman in a white coat who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Wells from Meadowbrook's Crisis Intervention Team. Mr. Mitchell, I'm here to conduct an emergency psychiatric evaluation based on reports of concerning behavior and potential self-harm. Dr. Wells spoke with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Your family is worried about your safety. I'm not experiencing any psychiatric emergency, and I haven't expressed any intention of self-harm. I kept my voice level, aware that everything I said would be analyzed for signs of agitation or confusion. I'm also not consenting to any evaluation or transport. Sarah stepped forward, her face arranged in an expression of pained concern that would have won awards for its authenticity. Bob, we found these in your kitchen yesterday. She held up a plastic bag containing what appeared to be a dozen white pills. You've been mixing your medications dangerously. David and I are terrified you're going to accidentally overdose. The pills in the bag were unfamiliar to me, but I recognized the setup. Sarah had planted evidence to support her emergency intervention claim. Dr. Wells examined the bag with professional interest, making notes on a clipboard. Mr. Mitchell, can you tell me what these medications are and why you were storing them loose in your kitchen? I've never seen those pills before in my life. Someone else placed them there. The words sounded paranoid even to me, exactly the response Sarah had calculated. I don't store any medications in my kitchen, and I certainly don't mix pills in unmarked containers. Dr. Wells and Sarah exchanged a glance that suggested they'd heard similar denials from other confused elderly patients. David stood behind them, his face pale with what looked like genuine distress. He wasn't acting. He truly believed that his father was deteriorating before his eyes. Bob, David said, his voice cracking slightly, we just want to make sure you're safe. The facility is just for observation, maybe a week or two until we can get your medication sorted out properly. Son, I'm going to say this once more, and I need you to hear it clearly. I'm not taking any medications except the ones Dr. Williams prescribed for my blood pressure. Someone has been drugging me without my knowledge, and the same person planted those pills in my kitchen. Doctor. Wells made more notes, her expression neutral but her body language suggesting she'd reached a preliminary conclusion. Mr. Mitchell, I understand you've been experiencing some confusion lately. That's not uncommon for people your age, especially after a significant loss like your wife's death. But we need to make sure you're not putting yourself at risk. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 police officers, summoned by Frank's emergency call. Officer Maria Santos, a compact woman with intelligent eyes, approached the group with the careful neutrality of someone walking into a family dispute. I understand there's a disagreement about medical care, Officer Santos said, looking from me to Dr. Wells to Sarah. Can someone explain the situation? Sarah immediately launched into her prepared narrative. My increasing confusion, the dangerous medication mixing, her fears for my safety. She produced the bag of pills as evidence, along with a folder containing what she claimed were incident reports documenting my declining mental state. Officer, my father-in-law has been making increasingly paranoid accusations about being poisoned, Sarah said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. Yesterday he called me at work claiming that I was trying to steal his money. He's becoming delusional. Dr. Wells nodded in agreement. Based on my preliminary assessment and the family's reports, I believe Mr. Mitchell may be experiencing a psychiatric emergency requiring immediate evaluation and possible involuntary commitment. Officer Santos turned to me, her expression professional, but not unkind. Mr. Mitchell, what's your perspective on this situation? This was the moment Margaret had prepared me for, the crossroads where everything would be decided. I pulled out my phone and showed Officer Santos the blood test results that Dr. Williams had uploaded to my medical portal. Officer, 3 days ago I had blood work done that showed the presence of 3 different psychiatric medications in my system. Medications I never took, all prescribed to my daughter-in-law. I kept my voice calm and factual. I have documentation of attempts to access my bank accounts, forged medical referrals made in my name, and evidence of a systematic campaign to make me appear mentally incompetent. Officer Santos studied the blood test results on my phone screen, her expression shifting as she read the clinical details. These medications, you're saying you never took them? That's correct. I have the prescription bottles they came from, all in Sarah's name, found in my medicine cabinet where I never put them. I gestured toward Sarah, who had gone very pale. Officer, someone has been poisoning me while building a case for my mental incompetency. Dr. Wells frowned, looking from me to Sarah with new uncertainty. Mrs. Mitchell, are you taking these medications? Lorazepam, Zolpidem, and Risperidone? Sarah's composure finally cracked. Yes, I have prescriptions for anxiety and sleep issues, but I would never. Bob is confused about his medications. He probably took them by accident. Ma'am, Officer Santos said, If these medications were found in Mr. Mitchell's bloodstream, and he says he never took them, we need to investigate how they got there. That's potentially a serious crime. The situation was unraveling rapidly. Doctor. Wells was retreating, her clipboard forgotten as she realized she might be in the middle of something far more complex than a simple family intervention. The orderlies from Meadowbrook were looking uncertain, their authority undermined by the police presence. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Outside with court order, hold position. Within minutes, Margaret Harrison arrived with a sheriff's deputy and a stack of legal documents. Her presence transformed the dynamic completely, introducing legal authority that superseded medical opinions and family concerns. I have an emergency court order establishing Mr. Mitchell's mental competency based on independent psychiatric evaluation, Margaret announced, handing copies to Officer Santos and Dr. Wells. I also have a restraining order prohibiting Sarah Mitchell from contact with Mr. Mitchell or his property pending investigation of elder abuse charges. Dr. Wells read the court documents with growing alarm. Mrs. Harrison, I was told this was a routine family intervention for an elderly man experiencing cognitive decline. Doctor, what you're looking at is an attempted kidnapping based on fraudulent medical claims. Mr. Mitchell has been systematically poisoned by his daughter-in-law as part of a scheme to gain control of his finances and property. Sarah finally found her voice, but it came out as a shrill protest that sounded nothing like her usual controlled tone. This is ridiculous. Bob is clearly paranoid and delusional. Look at him, hiring lawyers and investigators, making wild accusations. This is exactly the kind of behavior that proves he needs help. Margaret smiled with the cold satisfaction of an attorney who'd spent years dealing with financial predators. Mrs. Mitchell, paranoia would be an irrational fear of persecution. Mr. Mitchell's concerns are entirely rational, given that someone has been systematically drugging him while attempting to steal his assets. That's not paranoia. That's an appropriate response to criminal behavior. Officer Santos was reading the court documents with growing interest. Mrs. Harrison, these blood test results, they're showing deliberate drugging over an extended period? That's correct. Mr. Mitchell has been the victim of ongoing poisoning, apparently as part of a scheme to have him declared incompetent so his daughter-in-law could gain control of his estate. Margaret pulled out Frank's background investigation report. We've also discovered that Mrs. Mitchell has done this before, to her previous husband's elderly father. David, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke up. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he looked like a man watching his world collapse. Sarah, is this true? Have you been giving Dad medication without telling him? Sarah's mask finally slipped completely. Gone was the concerned daughter-in-law, replaced by something cold and calculating. David, your father is a paranoid old man who's been making wild accusations because he can't handle the fact that Martha is dead, and he's alone. I've been trying to help him, trying to protect our family from his increasingly erratic behavior. By drugging him? David's voice was rising now, genuine shock replacing his previous worried confusion. By trying to have him committed to a psychiatric facility? By doing what needed to be done to protect everyone, including him. Sarah's composure shattered completely. He's sitting on assets worth over $2 million while living like a pauper. Someone needs to make sure that money is managed properly instead of being wasted on lawyers and investigators and paranoid fantasies. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Officer Santos was already reaching for her handcuffs, while Margaret smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose strategy had worked perfectly. Mrs. Mitchell, Officer Santos said, you're under arrest for elder abuse, attempted poisoning, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence and David's ingratitude, I found myself standing in my own driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been my family. The Meadowbrook van was pulling away, its occupants no longer needed for an intervention that had become a criminal arrest. David stood alone beside his SUV, staring at the house where he'd grown up as if seeing it for the first time. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were filled with a pain I recognized from my own mirror during Martha's illness. Dad, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought she was trying to help. I walked over to my son and put my hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremor of someone whose world had just been turned inside out. David, she fooled both of us. The difference is that you were trying to help your father, and she was trying to destroy him. The courthouse steps were slick with December rain as I climbed toward the entrance. Margaret Harrison beside me carrying a briefcase that contained 3 months of evidence. Today was Sarah's arraignment, the formal beginning of the legal process that would hold her accountable for what she'd done to me and, as we'd discovered, to at least 2 other elderly victims in neighboring counties. Frank Rodriguez had spent the week since Sarah's arrest unraveling a network of elder abuse that stretched back over a decade. Sarah Chen, as she'd been known before marrying David, had left a trail of elderly victims across 3 states. Each case followed the same pattern: gain access to an elderly person's life through family connections, systematically undermine their mental competency through drugging and manipulation, then either gain control of their assets directly or facilitate their commitment to care facilities where she had accomplices. Bob, the prosecutor thinks we have one of the strongest elder abuse cases she's ever seen, Margaret said as we entered the courthouse lobby. The blood evidence, the surveillance recordings, the pattern of previous victims, it's overwhelming. The blood tests had revealed even more than we'd initially discovered. Dr. Williams had ordered additional screenings that showed traces of other medications in my system, including a mild blood thinner that could have caused dangerous interactions with my blood pressure medication. Sarah hadn't just been trying to make me appear confused. She'd been creating conditions that could have resulted in a medical emergency that would have justified emergency guardianship proceedings. Inside the courtroom, I took my seat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. David sat across the aisle, his face pale and drawn. He'd filed for divorce the day after Sarah's arrest, but the legal dissolution of their marriage would take months. The emotional dissolution had happened in my driveway, watching his wife being led away in handcuffs while confessing to crimes he'd never imagined possible. Sarah entered the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her face wearing an expression of defiant victimhood. She looked at me once, her eyes filled with the kind of cold hatred reserved for people who'd interfered with carefully laid plans. I met her gaze steadily, feeling none of the fear that her presence had once inspired. District Attorney Lisa Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, rose to address the judge. Your Honor, the defendant is charged with multiple felonies including elder abuse, attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and racketeering. The prosecution will show that Mrs. Mitchell engaged in a systematic campaign to incapacitate her father-in-law through the administration of psychiatric medications without his knowledge or consent, with the intent to gain control of his assets estimated at over $2 million. Sarah's public defender, a young man who looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, requested bail based on her lack of prior criminal convictions in this jurisdiction. Margaret had warned me this would happen. Sarah's previous activities in other states had never resulted in formal charges, making her appear to be a first-time offender. Your Honor, DHN responded, the defendant represents a significant flight risk and a continued danger to elderly victims. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of similar schemes in Illinois, Florida, and Nevada, involving at least 6 elderly victims over the past 12 years. The defendant has demonstrated a pattern of targeting vulnerable seniors, and we believe there may be additional victims who haven't yet come forward. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, studied the case files before making her decision. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial. Sarah's composure finally cracked. She turned toward the gallery, her voice rising above the courtroom murmur. This is all lies. Bob Mitchell is a paranoid old man who can't accept that he needs help. I was trying to protect my family. The outburst sealed any remaining doubt about Sarah's character. Even from the defendant's table, shackled and facing years in prison, she couldn't resist trying to manipulate the narrative one more time. After the hearing, Margaret and I met with DHN in her office to discuss the broader implications of Sarah's arrest. Frank's investigation had uncovered a network of accomplices in various care facilities and medical practices, people who'd been paid to facilitate Sarah's schemes by providing false documentation or inappropriate medical evaluations. Bob, we're looking at this as the tip of a much larger criminal enterprise, DHN explained. Sarah wasn't working alone. She had contacts in multiple states who helped her identify potential victims and create the legal framework for financial exploitation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sarah had cultivated relationships with unscrupulous doctors who would provide psychiatric evaluations supporting incompetency claims, lawyers who would file guardianship petitions based on fraudulent medical evidence, and care facility administrators who would house victims while their assets were systematically drained. "What happens to the other victims?" I asked. "We're working with law enforcement in 3 other states to reopen those cases. Your evidence, the recordings, the blood tests, the documentation of her methods, gives us a roadmap for investigating the earlier crimes." DA Chen pulled out a thick folder containing photographs and documents. Frank's background check revealed that Sarah's first victim died under suspicious circumstances in a Florida care facility. We may be looking at manslaughter charges in that case. The thought that Sarah's activities might have resulted in someone's death added a new dimension of horror to what I'd experienced. I remembered Frank's mention of her first husband's father, the man who died 6 months after being declared incompetent. The family had suspected foul play but hadn't been able to prove it. Now they might get the justice they'd been denied. Over the following weeks, as the investigation expanded, more details emerged about Sarah's systematic approach to elder abuse. She'd researched her targets carefully, identifying elderly people with substantial assets but limited family support networks. She'd cultivated relationships with their adult children, presenting herself as a caring daughter-in-law or family friend willing to help with the burden of caring for aging parents. The medical component of her scheme was particularly sophisticated. Sarah had accumulated knowledge of psychiatric medications through her various jobs in medical administration, learning which drugs would produce symptoms that mimicked dementia or mental illness. She'd established relationships with corrupt medical professionals who would provide the prescriptions she needed and the evaluations that supported her narratives of declining mental capacity. Frank's investigation revealed that Sarah had attempted to access my financial accounts using information she'd gathered from documents in David's house. She'd also made inquiries about my life insurance policies and had been researching the process for becoming my legal guardian. The timeline suggested that she'd been planning to have me declared incompetent within months of Martha's death, but had needed time to build the medical and legal foundation for her claims. The most chilling discovery was a notebook found in Sarah's belongings that contained detailed plans for my care management. She'd researched facilities in different states where she could have me placed once she gained legal control, focusing on locations that were far from my support network and had poor oversight records. The notebook included calculations of how long my assets would last at various spending levels, suggesting that she'd planned to systematically drain my resources over a period of years. David struggled with the revelations about his wife's true nature. He'd moved out of their shared home and was staying in a hotel while trying to process the extent of Sarah's deception. Our relationship, damaged by months of her manipulation, slowly began to heal as he understood how thoroughly she'd used his love for his father against both of us. "Dad, I keep thinking about all the times she pointed out things about your behavior," David said during one of our conversations. "She'd mentioned that you seemed tired or confused, and I'd start looking for signs that confirmed what she was saying. She taught me to see problems that weren't there." The psychological manipulation had been as damaging as the physical drugging. Sarah had used David's natural concern for his aging father to create an echo chamber where every normal sign of grief or fatigue became evidence of mental decline. She'd turned his love into a weapon against me, making him complicit in her abuse while believing he was protecting his father. The legal process moved forward with the methodical precision of a system designed to handle complex criminal cases. Sarah's public defender attempted to negotiate a plea bargain, but DA Chen was adamant about pursuing maximum penalties. The case had attracted attention from elder advocacy groups and law enforcement agencies dealing with similar crimes, making it a test case for prosecuting sophisticated financial elder abuse. As winter turned to spring, I found myself testifying before a grand jury, recounting the details of Sarah's systematic campaign against me. The experience was emotionally draining but necessary, providing the legal foundation for charges that would ensure Sarah couldn't victimize anyone else. The grand jury returned indictments on 17 separate charges, including attempted murder in connection with the blood thinner she'd been giving me. The prosecution argued that the combination of psychiatric drugs and blood thinners could have resulted in a fatal medical emergency, making Sarah's actions tantamount to attempted homicide. By the time Sarah's trial date was set for late summer, Frank's investigation had uncovered evidence linking her to the deaths of 3 elderly victims in other states. What had begun as a case of financial elder abuse had evolved into a multi-state investigation of serial crimes against vulnerable seniors. I sat in my kitchen one evening, reviewing the timeline of events that had brought us to this point, and marveled at how close Sarah had come to succeeding. If I hadn't noticed the bitter taste in her Thanksgiving cocktail, if I hadn't thought to have blood tests done, if I hadn't documented her activities so meticulously, I might have ended up in one of the facilities she'd researched, my assets draining away while my family believed they were protecting me from my own declining mental capacity. The house felt different now, not haunted by Martha's absence, but energized by the knowledge that justice was being served. Sarah would face the consequences of her crimes, and the network of accomplices she'd cultivated was being systematically dismantled by law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Most importantly, other elderly people would be protected from the kind of systematic abuse I'd experienced. Sarah's trial would establish legal precedents for prosecuting sophisticated elder abuse, and the publicity surrounding the case would educate families about the warning signs of financial exploitation. Martha's photograph on the mantel seemed to smile at me with approval. She'd always believed that standing up to bullies was a moral imperative, regardless of the personal cost. I'd stood up to Sarah, and in doing so, had helped protect countless other vulnerable seniors from similar predators. The justice system would handle the rest. 6 months after Sarah's conviction on all 17 charges, I stood in the kitchen of my house preparing Thanksgiving dinner for the first time since Martha died. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were approaching the anniversary of the night Sarah had tried to drug me into submission. This year, the only thing in my cocktail would be bourbon and gratitude. The trial had ended in August, with Sarah receiving a sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of additional charges pending in 3 other states. Her network of accomplices had largely crumbled under prosecution pressure, with several medical professionals losing their licenses and at least 2 care facility administrators facing their own criminal charges. The judge had called it one of the most sophisticated elder abuse conspiracies she'd encountered in 30 years on the bench. David arrived first, carrying a pie from the bakery Martha used to love, and wearing an expression that was lighter than I'd seen since before he married Sarah. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, with Sarah signing away any claim to David's assets from her prison cell. The legal process had been complicated by the discovery that much of what they'd owned together had been purchased with money stolen from previous victims. "Dad, how can I help?" David asked, setting the pie on the counter and looking around the kitchen that had once been the scene of Sarah's carefully orchestrated manipulation. "You can help by being here," I said, meaning it more than he probably realized. That's all I've ever wanted. Eleanor Henderson arrived next, carrying a casserole that smelled like heaven and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she was exactly where she wanted to be. Over the past months, Eleanor and I had developed a friendship that went beyond our shared experience of surviving Sarah's deceptions. She'd become a regular presence in my life, joining me for morning coffee and evening walks, helping to fill the silence that had threatened to swallow me after Martha's death. Eleanor brought enough food to feed half the neighborhood, I observed, watching her arrange covered dishes on the counter with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing holiday meals for decades. "That's because I invited half the neighborhood," she replied with a mischievous grin. "Mrs. Patterson from down the street is coming, and the new couple who moved into the Johnsons' place. And Frank Rodriguez said he might stop by after he finishes dinner with his own family." Frank had become more than just the investigator who'd helped save my life. He'd become a genuine friend. His work on Sarah's case had earned him recognition from law enforcement agencies across the country, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences about sophisticated elder abuse investigations. But more importantly to me, he'd proven that there were still people in the world who would fight for justice simply because it was the right thing to do. Dr. Williams arrived with his wife Caroline, bringing wine and stories about his recent retirement from active practice. He'd testified at Sarah's trial about the systematic nature of the poisoning, and his clear, factual presentation had been crucial in helping the jury understand the medical complexity of Sarah's crimes. "Bob, you look better than you have in years," Jim observed, studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd been monitoring my health for over 2 decades. The blood work from last month was perfect. No trace of anything that shouldn't be there. The regular blood tests had become routine, a way of monitoring my system for any lingering effects of Sarah's drugging campaign. But they also served as a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. My independence, my assets, possibly my life. Each clean test result felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to destroy me. As the afternoon progressed, my house filled with the sounds I remembered from holidays when Martha was alive. Conversations overlapping, laughter rising from different rooms, the clatter of dishes being passed around a table that hadn't seen this much activity in 2 years. It felt like coming back to life after a long, dark winter. Margaret Harrison stopped by during dessert, bringing legal documents that officially closed the last of the civil cases related to Sarah's crimes. The restitution payments from Sarah's seized assets had been distributed to her various victims, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the trauma and betrayal they'd experienced. "Bob, I have news about the other victims," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside mine with a cup of coffee and a slice of Eleanor's apple pie. "The family of Sarah's first victim in Florida has decided to establish a foundation for elder abuse awareness and prevention. They want to name it after their father and use your case as an example of how to fight back against financial predators. The idea that my experience could help protect other elderly people from similar abuse felt like the kind of purpose Martha would have approved of. Throughout her illness, she'd insisted that her suffering would only have meaning if it could somehow prevent others from going through the same ordeal." "Margaret, what would that involve?" "Speaking engagements, educational materials, maybe helping to train law enforcement officers and social workers to recognize the signs of sophisticated elder abuse. Your story, the way you documented everything, gathered evidence, built a legal case, could become a template for other victims." David looked up from his conversation with Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. "Dad, I think Mom would have loved that idea, turning what happened into something that could help other families." The mention of Martha brought a familiar ache, but it was softer now, tempered by time, and the knowledge that her memory was being honored through the choices I made every day. She'd taught me that love meant protecting the people you cared about, even when that protection required difficult decisions and uncomfortable confrontations. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, David helped me clear the dishes while Eleanor organized leftovers with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd been managing holiday cleanup for decades. The easy domesticity of it felt like a glimpse of what life could be like going forward. Not a recreation of what I'd had with Martha, but something new and equally valuable. "Dad," David said as we loaded the dishwasher, "I owe you an apology that's bigger than anything I've already said." I paused in my sorting of silverware to look at my son. At 38, he'd learned lessons about trust and manipulation that most people never have to face. The experience had aged him, but it had also made him more thoughtful, more careful about the people he allowed into his life. "David, you were trying to protect your father. Sarah used that love against both of us. You don't owe me an apology for caring. I owe you an apology for not listening when you tried to tell me what was happening, for assuming that your concerns were symptoms of confusion instead of evidence of clear thinking." He set down the plate he'd been holding and turned to face me fully. "I owe you an apology for almost letting someone steal your life while I stood by and helped them do it." The pain in his voice was genuine, and I recognized it as the same guilt I'd carried during Martha's illness every time I'd wondered if I could have done something differently, caught the cancer earlier, found better doctors. Guilt was the price of love, the burden that came with caring deeply about people you couldn't always protect. "Son, the most important thing is that we figured it out in time. Sarah didn't win, and we're both still here to have this conversation." Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her coat and carrying a bag of leftovers she'd insisted on taking home. "Bob, thank you for including me in this. It felt like being part of a real family again." The word family resonated in ways I hadn't expected. The traditional definition, blood relations bound by obligation and history, had been corrupted by Sarah's manipulation. But the broader definition, people who chose to care for each other's well-being, was sitting around my table tonight, washing my dishes, planning future gatherings. After everyone left, I sat in Martha's chair with a cup of coffee and the satisfaction that comes from a day well lived. The house felt different than it had during the dark months when Sarah was systematically destroying my life. Not just because the threat was gone, but because I'd filled it with people who genuinely cared about my well-being without wanting to control my choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank Rodriguez. "Great dinner. Thanks for including Maria and me. P.S. Got a call from Sacramento PD. They think they found another one of Sarah's victims from 2018. Your documentation is helping them build their case." The message reminded me that Sarah's conviction was just the beginning of a larger process of justice. Her crimes had rippled across multiple states and decades, leaving damaged families and traumatized elderly victims in their wake. But each new case that was reopened because of the evidence we'd gathered meant that other families might get the closure and justice they deserved. I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks with the comfortable routine of someone who felt safe in their own home. The security cameras Frank had installed were still active, but they no longer felt like defensive weapons. They were simply part of the infrastructure that allowed me to live independently and confidently. In the bedroom, I looked at the photograph of Martha that I kept on the nightstand. She was laughing in the picture, caught in a moment of pure joy during our vacation to Napa Valley 3 years before her diagnosis. I'd chosen that photograph because it reminded me that happiness was possible, even after loss, even after betrayal. "Martha," I said softly, "I think we did it. I think we protected what mattered." The foundation that Margaret had mentioned would give me a way to channel my experience into something constructive. Speaking to other elderly people about recognizing the signs of financial abuse, training law enforcement officers to investigate sophisticated elder crimes, helping families understand the importance of documentation and legal protection. It wouldn't bring back the months of fear and confusion Sarah had inflicted, but it might prevent other families from going through the same ordeal. It might save other elderly people from the terror of watching their independence and dignity slowly stripped away by someone they'd trusted. Outside my window, the November night was quiet and cold, but inside, my house felt warm and secure, not just because of the legal victories and criminal convictions, but because I'd learned that resilience wasn't just about surviving attacks on your dignity and independence. It was about rebuilding your life in ways that honored both what you'd lost and what you'd gained through the struggle. Sarah had tried to steal my life by making me appear incompetent and dependent. Instead, she'd forced me to become more capable and self-reliant than I'd ever imagined possible. She'd tried to isolate me from my family and community. Instead, she'd helped me discover who my real friends were and what genuine care looked like. The irony was perfect, and I thought Martha would have appreciated it. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up making you stronger than you ever knew you could be. And sometimes justice tastes even sweeter when it's served with Thanksgiving dinner.